terrific. For me, perhaps the most arresting image as a resident of the Boston area was in the discussion of Mission Hill and Mission Hill Extension. And there's a quotation in there that I'd like to begin with, where there was an observer who said, "In the rental office, there are two windows, one for Mission Hill and one for the extension. And except for the absence of two signs saying white and colored, it might be Birmingham, Alabama. There is literally a line of whites and a line of Negroes paying their rent." I think it's a sort of a bracing starting point for this discussion. And I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to give us your assessment based on your experience. How far along have we come from that? How much have things improved or not improved? And David Harris, if you're sitting right next to me, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you. I want to say how glad I am.
Closer.
Oh, Dante, can you tell me how to do this? Is this better?
Yeah. Tilt it up. Tilt it up. Yeah. There you go.
So I am glad to be here. I think I have mixed feelings about kind of how I respond to Richard's book, and in terms of the question as to where we are today, I do have to say that I think the lesson from Richard's book really is that our country is founded on and continues to operate based on racism. And that racism is quite simply the differential distribution of goods and resources and privilege according to race. And I think he's done a great job of helping us to understand that that includes formal government policy. And we are in a situation now where I think sadly, when we speak of remedies and things, it's become incredibly difficult to think about remedies at this point, unless we think very, very, very broadly and creatively. So what I will say is that I think we continue to be haunted by the policies and practices that he's outlined, and the results are that we have a situation in which, if you look at kind of classic studies of residential segregation, we will be told that in order to solve that and kind of eliminate it and kind of reach the levels of integration that replicate a region in general, we would have to move 50 to 60% of African Americans. I want you to note that it's always moving the African Americans to get us to integration, but that's just not likely to be possible. So I will say, and I'll leave it as this provocative statement that I'll come back to later, that at this point segregation is not the problem. Okay? I work at a place called the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. Charles Hamilton Houston gave his career to proving that separate but equal could not be equal in this country. I would say that the full sentence is separate but equal cannot be equal in this country because of racism. And until and unless we address the question of racism, we won't be able to resolve the problems we face.
IT Martin.
Okay, well that's an easy question to start us off with. The one side of me is kind of chuckles at the question a little bit, because I think of people saying things like, well, we had a black president, right? And then there's Oprah. You get list the 5 big things, and people get really defensive about it. And I bring that up because it goes to show how far we have not come. Because when you can list off the accomplishments, those top people in society who are black and have reached the pinnacle of success in spite of racism, then we still have a lot of work to do. It's not enough to be able to list off these anecdotal situations, because the numbers tell a different story. And I'd say when we talk about racism, we have to understand that it's dehumanizing, that it's within all of us, white people and people of color. And the reason, in my opinion, that we have not, and said, the reason that we have not actually made the type of transformational progress that we need to make is because we haven't dealt with ourselves. We haven't dealt with the fact that regardless of what policies or practices we're talking about, that we're the ones who vote on this stuff. We're the ones who vote these people into office. We're the ones who are practicing NIMBYism. So how do we reconcile the full spectrum of the layered approaches that we need to take to address the issues that includes dealing with ourselves and policy and how our institutions are operating? And then the last thing I'll say is there is this interesting piece that was brought up around kind of how policies and practices got us here. I'm going to add to that culture, right? And in terms of culture, what's acceptable behavior and ways of thinking that lead to these perverse outcomes? Because they are perverse outcomes, they're by design. And so as we think about root causes, that in order for those policies and practices to actually take hold in the ways that they did, we had a certain way of thinking in our culture and a certain level of acceptability, and we continue to, but unintentionally. But that doesn't mean that we're not guilty, all of us, white people and people of color, for holding up the system of racism. And so I hope we talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Crystal?
I want to thank everybody for having me here as well. I can't remember what the question was.
The question was, from the days of the separate windows at the Mission Hill and Mission Lake
I
Center,
remember now.
How
Thank
far
you.
along? Have we made some progress, a lot of progress, no progress? Where are we at?
I think we've made some progress. I'm torn about it as well, right? But I grew up in a household where I had to hear the stories of my father growing up in Virginia and what that was like. And so my life is not like that. So I feel like, yes, we've made some progress. But I also know, but it's like, we had so far to go that because we came a little bit, doesn't mean that the progress that we've made is enough. Let me say it like that. Given the amount of time that we've been through. And what the difficult part is, because it takes so long, we continue to lose generations of African Americans and leave them behind, and it further expands the gap between, not just those who have and have not on a racial basis, but those who have and have not even within the race. And that creates all kinds of tensions to which Dr. Martin was referring to.
Richard, do you want to offer an assessment?
Well, sure. I entirely agree with my panelists, my fellow panelists. First of all, I think, I already made clear, I think segregation is the problem. It's not at all hard to think of policies that we could follow to desegregate this country. I'm actually hopeful about the story I told, because so long as we thought it happened by accident, as I said, we think it only cannot happen by accident. Once we understand that it was done by explicit government policy, there are many obvious policies that we could follow that would accomplish substantial desegregation. We could abolish exclusionary zoning ordinances in the all-white suburbs surrounding major cities. And then we could take programs like the low-income housing tax credit and the Section 8 program and require that they prioritize opportunities to move to the suburbs that presently exclude them. So there are many such policies. Before the 1960s, it was inconceivable to us that we could have abolished segregation in the other areas of life. I don't think anybody could have foreseen it. And I think it may seem inconceivable now that we could desegregate this country, but stranger things have happened. Let me just say, the very first job I ever had was in 1965, I think it was. I was a research assistant at the Chicago Urban League. And the job I had was to go through some kind of manual of corporate structures of Chicago and identify all the policy-making positions in corporations in the city of Chicago. And I and a couple of other researchers identified 4,000 policy-making positions in the private sector in Chicago. Not a single one was held by an African American. Not a single one. At that time, fewer than 10%, something between 5 and 10% of African American young adults were college graduates. Today it's 25%. Still far below the 40-something% of whites, but that's considerable progress that would have been inconceivable to me or to the people who are reading this report that I wrote in 1965 about the corporate sector of Chicago. So I think it's possible. The impediment we face is not the inability to think of what kinds of policies we would follow to desegregate the country. The impediment is political will and political mobilization. And that's why I keep on emphasizing we need a new civil rights movement around residential segregation. Understanding the history clearly is not going to be enough, but understanding the history has to be an important step.
I just want
Yeah, please.
thank you. And I just wanted to add that I think we're actually in agreement. We're not having a disagreement. I think what we're actually, you just said it without adding the word racism in there when we said we don't have the political will. Why don't we have the political will? Because we have all been indoctrinated and conditioned into a way of being that keeps us separated from each other. And we've gone through decades and decades and generations after generation of constant indoctrination into the other, in that we are not the same, when in fact our humanity and the things that are most important to us and the things that we need to thrive are the same, except we've been distracted by race and racism in particular from being able to connect the dots to see those common struggles, and in fact how racism hurts white people too. We can talk about that later. But just in terms of when you talk about segregation, there's a reason why there's no political will. And so to your point about understanding history, that's why your book is so amazingly important, because it's, in my opinion, one of the two main factors of why racism and the racial inequities we see continue to persist, is because we don't understand our history. We don't understand how we got to the inequities we see in communities today, and therefore we tend to get lost in individual behavior instead of the system. We put the problem on the individuals instead of the system, and that's why your book has been so incredibly powerful and important to understand how all of these pieces come together.
Okay, I'm sorry. I do want to say, like, I am in disagreement. I appreciate the perspective, but to David's point, the whole idea behind racism is that if I'm going to have a good life, I got to live like a white person. Right? I gotta live where white people live, I gotta go to the schools that white people go to, and these are all systems that are designed for that culture, right? And the things that are inherent about that culture to be successful. What do they call a low-income community with mostly Italians? Little Italy. What do they call a low-income community with mostly Asians? Chinatown. What do they call a low-income community with mostly black folks? The ghetto. A concentrated poverty, right? And it's not about that there's this one race that lives there. It's this one race that lives there and which we don't invest in the school, and which the cops don't show up. We have the worst teachers. And so I would like a policy, if we're going to do a policy, and isn't one in which we have to integrate neighborhoods, because quite frankly, I don't want to integrate your neighborhood. I would like to live and wake up and live around people who look like me, who share my culture. And why am I a bad person? Because I want to do that. I would much rather talk about policies that make the same kinds of investments in those communities that we do in other communities.
So can I?
Please.
Said a lot of it, but I do think it's really important for us to understand. I think Richard spoke about the need for us to understand kind of lived experience, and I would say that if we're thinking about public policy, the will we need is the will to make the kind of investments that will in fact remedy this situation. Okay, that's what's lacking. And the will, that has to do with, I suspect, I often say, if we were to kind of formulate public policy based on what people express as their needs, I don't think that people living in areas of concentrated poverty, so-called the ghetto, I think they want the same thing that people living in Newton and in Cambridge and elsewhere want. They want safe, affordable housing, they want communities that are thriving. We read about knowing what works. We know that thriving communities work. We know that thriving communities can help the achievement gap, blah, blah, blah. We don't, unless we're speaking code, thriving doesn't mean white, of course. It does. But the fact of the matter is, if that's our public policy, then we need to redistribute the way in which resources are allocated, and we need to start to do what Crystal's saying and invest in communities. And we're not going to move our way out of this. And so the final point is, I think I spent a lot of my career thinking about and working toward eliminating racial discrimination in housing. I believe integration is a social goal that we can all share. But as a practical matter, integration is different from desegregation. And as Crystal said, moving a poor family into a suburb doesn't make that person any less poor. And it's not the solution.
So there's a lot of different strands there, and I'd like to pick up on one of them at the moment. David Harris, you mentioned our public policy, and Atia Martin, you talked about the system. You also said something kind of interesting. You talked about NIMBYism. Richard, you talked about exclusionary zoning. One of the complications on this issue, when we're talking about segregation within neighborhoods, is that decisions are made at various levels of government. And decisions were made at the high level within the Federal Housing Administration to not subsidize mortgage for Black returning GIs. At the same time, these decisions about zoning, about restrictive uses of land are made very much at the local level. And I would add, in Massachusetts, we have 351 cities and towns that are very empowered, have a long history of making their own zoning decisions, some of which involve 2- and 3-acre lots. And so actually, Crystal, you've been in state government. You've also been outside state government. I'd like you to, if you can tell us, when the policy is problematic, if you want to use that term, but it exists on multiple levels, how do you come to any sort of policy solution that would actually help people do the things you want to do?
So I'm a community developer, as you can tell. So I think about things as investing in communities. I will say and I'm also a very city girl, right? Like I'm from New York, I live in Boston, I'm very kind of urban. And as part of being in this job, my previous job, it opened me up to the idea of what it means to be hyper-local. As Dante says, we live in a state in which we have 351 zoning laws, right? Every place is different. And it's become such a huge conversation that the governor is like one of the first governors in a long time to list housing as an issue that he's confronting. But it's hard, right? Because you got 351 cities and towns, and he's got to get elected. And people don't like change, right? I don't want to presume that it's about race. I'm just saying, it's just hard to get people to change. And oftentimes, because land use is as fundamental to our kind of American sort of ethos, the way we think, as racism is, right? It's a basic part of it's a basic part of our history. Getting people to give up the idea that they get to say what happens in that lot next door is a hard push, right? Because from elected officials, we have a system in which you got to get elected by those same people. And those are the people who think about things and remember things. And so the other thing I will say is working in government, the other thing I learned is change is incremental. And when you think about what kinds of changes you want to make, you can't change, 100 years of disinvestment and bad policy in one election cycle. And so what is the next increment that you're going to make? And it's great to say that we're going to do away with exclusionary zoning. But like, you haven't been outside of Cambridge. That's not gonna happen. Like, I mean, and those meetings, those public meetings in which they have conversations that's not even, doesn't even get to the those people kind of conversations. Those meetings are brutal and ugly, and people whose kids go to school together, like, it's nasty outside. And these become very fundamental kinds of emotional issues. And so for us, what we've been trying to think about is like, what is the next, what have we done already? And how has that worked? And so what is the next thing to do to try to keep moving along this line?
David Harris, could you respond to that?
Remind me of the exact question.
Well, I mean, the question is basically, and you've talked in very sort of big picture terms about the sort of overarching problems that you observe. We've been talking about also things that exist at multiple levels of government, places outside of Cambridge where people are going to stick to their exclusionary zoning. How do you create change in that type of a context?
So I do think that the change is going to have to be local. I think it's interesting when I think of the word "we" in terms of public policy is what Kessler called grammatical fiction. Right? So the "we" is not really "we," it's "they." And I think that from my perspective, one of the most important things is for people to kind of understand this history that's been laid out here. I think that's really important, and to start to organize and mobilize around it and start to become much more involved in the public policy discussions we have. And I think if that happens, we'll see that things like asthma, for instance, right? Which means asthma. Asthma is a fair housing issue. Asthma is a housing issue. It's not a health issue. It's something that if we're going to talk about how do we address the effects of concentrated poverty, we have to talk about asthma. Right? We have to talk about resolving asthma so that you don't have to move to get away from asthma. Right? Why isn't it your fundamental right to have some health? Right? Violence, same thing. So I think, but until and unless people start to take the information that's being discussed here and mobilize and try to change, I think it's true that we need to change things on a local level. You folks here in Cambridge are doing a good job of that. You're very organized. I think we have to do that everywhere. And the changes have to be ways that we get more people involved in the political process. I'm not a big fan of voting. I don't think voting's the cure-all. But I think there are forms of activism and engagement that we need to encourage people who have been excluded consistently across the centuries can partake of. And it is local. We're not going to change Ben Carson and HUD and all that stuff. He's going to be on his $30,000 couch. But so Dante, yes. I mean, I think it's true. And I'll tell you one story, because I told Richard, I tell this before, but in 1968, I was a senior in high school. I was running in a track meet in California. I was running in a school called Westchester High School, which Richard mentioned, right? Westchester is one of those communities that was created for white folks, right? And on that day, April 4th, 1968, as we were getting on the bus, there was an announcement came over the loudspeaker that Martin Luther King had been shot. And people in that crowd cheered. Right? People in that crowd cheered. And it stayed with me 50 years later. Now, the fact is, today, Westchester is all people of color. Right? So things happen in this country, and they happen by race. And if we aren't, so I think, and it's local. I mean, Westchester, I'm talking about a town. Right? So we really have to find ways to elevate those voices of people living in communities such that they can determine and define what their own fate is.
Richard, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I don't disagree with that. I do think that progress is possible. We have examples of it, but clearly the main thing we need is political mobilization and organization. I wasn't suggesting that abolishing exclusionary zoning is possible today, but for political reasons. But we do have, for example, New Jersey has adopted a fair share program in which every community, even the most affluent suburb, has to develop housing to include its fair share of the region's low-income population. We have an affluent community like Montgomery County outside of Washington, D.C. that has an inclusionary zoning program that requires all developers not only to set aside a share of their units for moderate income housing, but then the Public Housing Authority buys a third of those set-aside units for its public housing population. And the reality is that when families move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, their outcomes improve. A poor family living in a high opportunity neighborhood, the children have more of a chance of going to college, the adults have more of a chance of being employed, the health outcomes are better, and and progress is possible. But first we need to understand that it is possible. We need to understand that, let me just say this one thing, if I could tell another story, if I may. You know, some of you bought the paperback book. The paperback book has something in it that the hardcover doesn't. And in the paperback book has a discussion guide at the back of it. In the discussion guide, I describe a letter I got from a high school student, or a recent high school graduate in New Orleans. He was an African-American high school graduate. He said he grew up in a segregated neighborhood in New Orleans. It was a poor neighborhood. He looked around and he saw that black people were poor, that white people were rich. He thought that was the natural way things were going to be. And then he said he read my book, obviously in the hardcover version, and he realized the government had created this difference. This wasn't a condition of the people, it was a condition of the government, and a creation of government. He said if he had realized that, he might have worked harder in high school. And you know, social scientists, psychologists call that stereotype threat. But it's the opposite as well. That is, if white people come to understand how this happened, their stereotypes of African Americans might also change as well, because you know, one of the things that happens is when you concentrate African Americans in low-income, overcrowded neighborhoods and slums develop, it's understandable that whites think of African Americans as slum dwellers. If they understand that these conditions were not the characteristics of the people, but were imposed by government, their views might change as well. So I'm not suggesting that.
I'm sorry, part of why people think that is because the white media focuses on the idea that black folks live like that. Most people who live in public housing aren't black. And so some of that is all about how the system continues to perpetuate folks, low income, particularly black folks, low income, and how they live, and that kind of thing. And I'm sorry, I just go back to the idea that we need to make different investments. I grew up in a predominantly African American community, and I went to a predominantly white school. I was one of those kids, I was wicked smart, right? So I went to one of those schools, right? I was the only black kid in the class, right? Do you know how hard that was for me at 12? Like, that's not cute. And so why, I got a decent education, whatever the case may be, but like, you know, those were really, really challenging times for me. And so what is it that I have to give up? Why do I always have to give up something in order to get that thing? In order to get something that people, like, why we have universal health care, but we don't have universal housing? Yeah. Why do we all fight about universal health care, but housing isn't a basic right? But everybody should have health care? I've never understood that.
Sorry. Again, there's a lot of threads going on here. I just want to check, Richard, was there one last thought that you had wanted to add to that, or?
I've had plenty of time.
Okay.
I'm sure I'll have more.
Sure.
I think one of the places that we have to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about policies, you know, I agree that we need to open up the suburbs and all that kind of stuff, but you all probably know how you get one of those prime units, right? How do you get it, right? You get on a lottery, right? How do you get into Medco, right? You sit on a waiting list, right? So that's public policy by lottery. That's public policy by luck. And what I'm saying is it's time for us to be a little bit more forthright about the public policies we need. And we can't leave it to luck, and it can't be for those who are lucky enough to rise to the top on the list, who are lucky enough to get an affordable mortgage, who are lucky enough to get a slot in Medco. So we might need to do all of those things, but there's a lot more we have to focus on.
Just to shift the conversation a little bit, I'd like to incorporate some questions from folks in the audience. So this question says, do you know of any cases of successful integration as a result of deliberate policy in areas that were previously residentially segregated? I guess I would expand that question to, do you, based upon your experience, know of other communities in the state, in this country, that have made an earnest and successful effort to tackle some of the problems that we've been talking about tonight? Tia Martin, you and I were talking earlier. For folks who don't know it, she was the head of the City of Boston's Resilience Initiative and did a lot of research on other communities and what stuff other places were doing. Can you give us any positive examples?
I love how he gives me the hard stuff. So I won't speak to integration per se, because I think that's not necessarily the outcome that some of the examples that we discussed are meant to address. What they're meant to address is how do we embed racial equity and social justice into how we do policies at the local level. And not just how we do policies, but also how we actually implement them, right? So we have a lot of work that's been done by organizations like the Government Alliance for Race and Equity and the Haas Institute and all these great folks who have helped to put together these types of lenses. And I think Seattle was one of the first cities to really kind of take it on and in a deep way across all of government. Now they made some missteps, which we worked with them and having conversations about and learning what were some of those missteps, so that as we in Boston were looking to apply some of this work that we wouldn't make. And I'd say the first one, which is something that you actually mentioned, David, which is they didn't engage the community as they put these policies in place. And so it was invisible to the community, there was no transparency to the community, and limited accountability. And so that's kind of a lesson from Seattle. They've had a lot of incremental progress, but because of that and the fact that they didn't account for the human factor, which is how do you make sure that on the implementation side, these policies actually are done within departments and in terms of the work product for communities. And so their gap was that they didn't actually train the frontline people who are working in government on these issues, why it was important, how it was gonna make their lives easier, their jobs better, how it was gonna serve the community.